Sarah Jane had always believed that love, when built on trust and respect, could withstand anything. She married David with that certainty in her heart. As an accomplished attorney, she was no stranger to battles and negotiations, but with David, she thought she had found peace. In the beginning, it was a fairy tale. They spent late nights wrapped in each other's arms, whispering about dreams and future plans. Morning coffee was their quiet ritual, each sip a promise of devotion. They built a life that sparkled on the outside dinner parties, shared holidays, the kind of life others envied. But as time passed, shadows crept in. David's business trips became more frequent, his phone always locked and face down on the table. He'd return home, smelling of expensive cologne that wasn't his usual scent. His eyes didn't light up the way they used to. Sarah Jane, though, determined to believe in him, felt the icy chill of doubt creeping into their once warm home. At first, she blamed herself. Maybe she worked too much buried in late-night depositions and early morning client calls. But deep down, she knew it wasn't her fault. She had fought hard to become one of the most respected attorneys in the city, and she wouldn't let herself be gaslit into thinking her ambition made her less of a wife. The truth was, they're lurking in the quiet moments and unspoken words. She just didn't want to see it until the night she finally did. In that moment, the perfect life she had worked so hard to build with David began to crumble piece by piece until nothing but a shell of betrayal remained. The night Sarah Jane finally saw it all laid bare was one she'd never forget. It was a Thursday evening, one of those cool, still nights in early autumn, where the wind carried the faintest chill and the leaves rustled like whispers of warning. She had come home early from court, feeling the weight of her latest trial hanging heavily on her shoulders. She longed for the comfort of her husband's arms, for that sweet ritual of sharing a glass of wine and debriefing the day. But David wasn't home. Again. His absence had become routine, though she'd been trying so hard to keep the hope alive. But tonight, that hope was slipping through her fingers like sand. She wandered through the quiet house, each echo of her footsteps a grim reminder of the emptiness growing between them. She told herself he was probably caught up at the office or stuck in traffic. That's what she'd always told herself. But tonight, she didn't want excuses. She set her briefcase down and went to the bedroom, her heart a flutter of nerves she didn't understand. She reached for David's laptop, an old one he barely used anymore, hoping to find the airline confirmations for his supposed trip to Chicago. She wasn't snooping, she told herself. She was simply trying to make sense of the unraveling threads of her life. The laptop was password protected, but David had never been clever with passwords. On the third try, she cracked it his mother's maiden name. What she found wasn't flight itineraries or work emails. It was a secret Facebook account. The profile picture was of David, but not the David she knew, the smiling, devoted husband he pretended to be. This David was posing beside a woman who could have been ripped from a magazine cover, young, blonde, flawless. Sarah Jane's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she clicked through the photos. The captions told the story of a man head over heels for someone who was not his wife. Her stomach churned as she read their flirtatious comments, saw the weekend getaways documented in selfies she'd never seen. She felt a wave of nausea, a dull ache in her chest. For a moment, she couldn't even process the betrayal. It was too raw, too monstrous to comprehend. She scrolled further, her eyes skimming the digital trail of lies David had spun. Each word was a fresh slap to her pride, a deep cut to her heart. She closed the laptop with a hard click and stood there in the silence of their bedroom, her mind racing. How long had this been going on? Who was she, this perfect stranger who'd stolen her husband's affection? The questions clawed at her throat, but deep down, Sarah Jane already knew the answer. This wasn't some one-time mistake or drunken fling. This was deliberate. This was a choice. The pain turned quickly into anger. White-hot electric. She had given so much of herself to this man, her trust, her time, her unwavering loyalty. She had believed in the life they were building together, in the promises they made on that warm June day when they said "I do." And he had repaid her with lies. She didn't cry right away. She was too stunned. But as the hours passed and the night deepened, the tears finally came. She curled up on their bed. No, not their bed anymore, and let the sobs rack her body. She grieved not just for the betrayal, but for the woman she had been. The woman who had believed in fairy tales and happy endings, who thought love was enough to hold a marriage together. When the last tear fell, Sarah Jane pushed herself up and wiped her face. Her reflection in the mirror was a stranger red eyes, trembling lips, a hollow ache in her gaze. But beneath that pain, something else flickered resolve. She was no victim. She wouldn't let herself be swallowed by heartbreak. The next morning, she confronted David. He was at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. She dropped the laptop in front of him with a cold clatter, her eyes locked on his face. "Care to explain this?" she asked, her voice as calm as the eye of a storm. David looked up startled, but only for a moment. Then he smiled a smug, careless smile that made her blood boil. "Sarah, you're making a scene," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're always so dramatic." "Don't patronize me," she snapped, her voice hard. "How long, David? How long have you been cheating on me?" He didn't even flinch. "Does it matter?" he said with a shrug. "You're always too busy with your cases, your fancy law degree. You don't have time for me anymore." The words were a slap, but she refused to let him see the hurt. "So you decided to find someone younger, someone prettier." She pressed her tone cold as steel. He set his phone down, his smile fading. "You're just not what I need anymore, Sarah. You're competent, sure, but you're not exciting, not beautiful. I'm tired of pretending." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She stared at the man she had once loved, seeing him clearly for the first time. The man who had vowed to cherish and honor her was gone, replaced by a selfish, entitled stranger. She felt the final thread of their marriage snap. "I've given you everything," she whispered. "I've stood by you through every setback, every late night. And this is how you repay me." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. His silence was answer enough. In that moment, Sarah Jane realized something profound. She had been fighting for a man who didn't even respect her, let alone love her. And that was the last time she would ever beg for his affection. She gathered her things, her dignity, her resolve, and left the house without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, and with it the chapter of her life she had spent years building. She stepped into the cool night air, her heart still raw, but her mind clear. The truth had finally been laid bare, and there was no turning back. Sarah Jane took a long, deep breath, feeling the weight of the betrayal, but also the freedom that came with it. This was the end of one story, but she knew it was only the beginning of another, a story where she would write her own rules, where no one, especially not David, would ever make her doubt her worth again. Sarah Jane didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of David's betrayal pressing down on her chest like a stone. But in that darkness, something else began to bloom: determination. It was no longer about heartbreak or even revenge. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully hers. If David thought he could discard her like some broken ornament and walk away unscathed, he had underestimated the woman he'd married. The next morning, she rose with the sun, her mind already racing with ideas. She dressed in her favorite tailored suit, the one that made her feel like she could conquer the world, and headed into her office downtown. The towering glass building had always been her sanctuary, a place where her sharp mind was her greatest weapon, where she felt most alive. She sat behind her mahogany desk, the city skyline stretching out before her, and let her thoughts sharpen into a plan. She remembered the prenup. It had been David's idea in the beginning, an agreement to protect his precious business empire. He had insisted on it, certain that she would never need to enforce it. But what David hadn't counted on was the clause she'd fought to include: if he was ever unfaithful, she was entitled to half of his business. At the time, he had laughed, thinking it was an empty gesture. Now it was her lifeline. She pulled the contract from her safe, the crisp pages rustling as she read the words she knew by heart. In the event of infidelity, Sarah Jane shall be entitled to a 50% share of all business assets. She smiled a small, fierce smile. David had signed it in his own arrogant scrawl, never imagining he'd one day regret it. Sarah Jane knew David would try to wriggle out of it. He was cunning, always had been. But she was smarter. She needed a lawyer, someone who could fight with the same fire she held inside. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by David's posturing or his wallet. She scrolled through her contacts, her finger pausing over one name, Ethan James. A well-respected divorce attorney, known for his tenacity and refusal to back down. She called him immediately, her voice calm and measured. "Ethan, I need your help. My husband has crossed a line, and I won't let him walk away from it." There was a pause on the other end before he spoke. "I'll make time for you today," he said, his tone solemn. "Come to my office at noon." By the time she stepped into Ethan's office, she was ready. She carried with her not just the prenup, but every shred of evidence. She'd uncovered the secret Facebook profile, the photos, the messages dripping with betrayal. Ethan listened quietly as she laid it all out, his expression shifting from surprise to quiet fury. "David's playing a dangerous game," Ethan said, finally tapping the stack of evidence she'd placed before him. "And he doesn't realize who he's dealing with." Sarah Jane met his gaze, her voice steady. "He thinks he can wear me down. He's counting on me to give up. But I'm not backing down, Ethan. Not this time." Ethan nodded, his respect for her clear in his eyes. "Good. Because I don't intend to lose Sarah Jane. We'll make sure he doesn't get away with this." As they strategized, Sarah Jane felt the first flicker of hope since she'd discovered David's betrayal. She wasn't powerless. She had the law on her side and her own unwavering resolve. When they finished, Ethan offered her a reassuring smile. "Let me handle the legal battles," he said. "You focus on staying strong." But Sarah Jane wasn't content to sit back and wait. She knew David too well, knew how he operated, how he lied and manipulated. She needed to stay 2 steps ahead. That afternoon, she began gathering every document she could find, tax records, business ledgers, even old emails that might prove his duplicity. She spent hours in her office, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her mind a laser beam of focus. By evening, she had a thick binder of evidence ready to go. She sat back in her chair, exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time in days, she felt in control. The betrayal still stung, but now it was fuel. She wouldn't let David's actions define her. She would define herself. When she got home that night, the house felt different, less like a tomb of broken promises and more like a staging ground for a new beginning. She poured herself a glass of red wine and let the bitterness of it settle on her tongue. She was done crying, done doubting. The woman staring back at her in the mirror wasn't a victim, she was a survivor. The next morning she texted David, "I'm moving out. You'll hear from my lawyer soon." His reply came quickly, dripping with his usual arrogance. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Sarah Jane. You're not getting a cent of my business." She read it with a cold, steady calm. "Watch me," she thought, a smile playing on her lips. True to her word, she packed her things that weekend and moved back into her childhood home, a modest brick house with a cozy garden she'd always loved. It felt safe, like a cocoon from the storm that was about to rage. She told no one what was happening, keeping her circle small and her heart guarded. But David didn't give up easily. A few days later, he showed up at her door, his face twisted in a mask of contrition. "Sarah Jane, let's talk about this," he pleaded. "You don't need to drag it out in court. Let's settle this between us." She let him in, her expression unreadable. "There's nothing to talk about," she said evenly. "You made your choices. Now live with them." He tried to charm her the same way he always had, but she saw through him, saw the desperation in his eyes, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. "I'm not that woman anymore," she told him softly. "The one who believed your lies. I'm done." David's face hardened. "You think you're so clever, but you'll never win. I'll fight you every step of the way." Sarah Jane didn't flinch. "Do your worst," she said. "I'm not afraid of you." And she meant it. In that moment, she understood that this wasn't just about money or even betrayal. It was about power, about reclaiming hers. She wouldn't let David bully her, wouldn't let him rewrite the story of her life. This was her story now, and she was done playing by his rules. As David stormed out, slamming the door behind him, Sarah Jane felt a calm settle over her. The battle had begun, and she was ready. She was no longer the woman who'd believed in fairy tales. She was a fighter, and she wouldn't stop until she'd won. Sarah Jane's resolve only grew stronger in the days that followed her final showdown with David at her childhood home. Each morning, she woke with a fierce clarity that replaced the hollow ache of betrayal. She was done feeling like a victim. She was done second-guessing her instincts. David might have thought he could break her spirit, but he'd only sharpened her determination to fight back. She threw herself into her work at the law firm during the day, but her nights were devoted to gathering evidence and building her case. Every bank statement, every business transaction she could dig up, she pored over them with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that even the smallest detail could turn the tide in her favor. She was meticulous and methodical, driven by a purpose that gave her strength. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed someone in her corner who could match her drive, someone who wouldn't flinch in the face of David's manipulations. That's where Ethan James came in. He had agreed to represent her, and from the very first conversation, she knew she had made the right choice. The day they met at the quiet cafe downtown was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that carried a promise of change. Sarah Jane arrived early, settling into a corner booth, where she could see the door. She wore a navy dress suit that made her look as composed as she felt her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail that highlighted her determined gaze. When Ethan arrived, he looked tired but resolute. His briefcase was heavy with documents, and he gave her a tight smile as he slid into the seat across from her. "Sarah Jane," he greeted, his voice low and respectful. "You look ready." "I am," she said simply. "I've brought everything I could find, every shred of evidence that proves David's betrayal. I want to make sure there's no doubt when this goes to court." He nodded, his expression serious. "Let's get started then." As she handed over the neatly organized folders, she watched the way his brow furrowed with each damning detail. The photos of David and his mistress, the text messages that dripped with false promises, the cold financial records that showed just how deeply David's deception ran. Ethan's lips tightened as he read, his fingers drumming on the table. "This is damning," he said finally, looking up at her with a mixture of respect and concern. "David is in deeper than I thought. And with the prenup, you're in a strong position." Sarah Jane leaned back, her eyes steady. "David doesn't think I have the guts to see this through. He's counting on me to back down. But I'm not going to. He needs to know that I'm serious." "You're not just serious," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You're formidable. He'll see that soon enough." Their meeting stretched on for hours, the sun shifting in the sky, as they went over every detail, every angle. Ethan was thorough, but Sarah Jane was relentless, pushing him to consider every possibility, every tactic David might use to delay or distract. She knew David better than anyone. She knew how his mind worked, the games he liked to play, and she was determined to be one step ahead. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes tired but alive with purpose. "I have to ask," he said quietly. "Are you sure you're ready for this? Once we file, it's going to get ugly. David will do everything he can to paint you as vindictive, to turn this into a circus." Sarah Jane's jaw tightened. "I know, but I've lived in his shadow for too long. I'm not afraid of the fight. I'm afraid of what happens if I don't stand up for myself." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, let's move forward." They parted ways outside the cafe, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Sarah Jane watched him go, feeling a flicker of hope. She wasn't in this alone anymore, and for the first time, she let herself believe that she could actually win. But the real confrontation came the next day, when Ethan arranged a meeting with David and his lawyer, a man named Richard, who was as slick as he was ruthless. They gathered in a sterile conference room downtown, the air heavy with tension. Sarah Jane sat at the end of the polished table, her chin held high, her expression calm. David sat across from her, his face a mask of practiced indifference. Richard started the meeting with a smooth smile, his voice dripping with false charm. "Let's be reasonable, Sarah Jane. David has no intention of prolonging this. Surely we can find a solution that works for everyone." Sarah Jane met his gaze coolly. "There is a solution," she said. "David honors the prenup he signed. I get half of what I'm owed." David scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You're delusional if you think I'm giving up half of my business." "You signed the contract," Sarah Jane reminded him, her voice even. "You made that promise. That was before you turned into someone I don't even recognize," he snapped. "You're not the woman I married." Sarah Jane's eyes narrowed. "No, I'm not," she said softly. "I'm stronger. And I'm done letting you decide my worth." Richard tried to interject, but Ethan cut him off. "David's infidelity is well documented," he said, his tone crisp and professional. "The prenup is clear. If you want to drag this out, we're prepared to go to court, and we'll win." David's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he masked it quickly. "You're bluffing," he said, his voice tight. "You don't have the stomach for this, Sarah Jane." She leaned forward, her voice low and cold. "Try me." For a moment, the room was silent, the air crackling with unspoken threats and quiet resolve. Then Richard cleared his throat, shuffling his papers. "Let's take a short recess," he suggested. "David and I need to discuss our options." As they stepped out, Sarah Jane let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan gave her a nod of quiet encouragement. "You're doing great," he said. "Keep your head up." She did, because she knew this was only the beginning. David would try to stall, to intimidate, to twist the narrative until he was the victim. But she wasn't playing his game anymore. She was ready for every lie, every manipulation. When the door opened and David returned, his face was pale, his eyes hard. "Fine," he said flatly. "We'll settle. But don't think for a second that you're getting more than you deserve." Sarah Jane's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. "Oh, I'm not getting more than I deserve, David. I'm getting exactly what you promised me." As the meeting wrapped up and she stepped out into the brisk evening air, Sarah Jane felt a surge of triumph. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, she felt the balance of power shift in her favor. She would see this through to the end, no matter how long it took. Sarah Jane knew that the meeting with David and Richard was just the opening move in a much longer game. As she walked out of that conference room, she could almost feel the balance of power shift, subtle but unmistakable. For once, David was on the defensive, forced to face the consequences of his lies and betrayals. She didn't let herself celebrate just yet, though. She knew David too well. He wasn't the type to admit defeat without a fight. That night, she found herself awake again, the weight of the day's confrontation pressing heavy on her chest. But unlike the sleepless nights that had haunted her before, there was no fear in her thoughts, only a quiet, steely resolve. She had made her stand, and she wouldn't let anyone, least of all David, break her down again. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a message from David. "Can we talk alone?" She stared at the words, her heart steady. This was exactly what she expected, a desperate attempt to salvage what little control he thought he still had. She almost ignored the message, but something inside her, a flicker of curiosity, maybe made her agree. They met at the house they had once shared, the place that had been the setting of so many of her dreams and heartbreaks. She stepped through the door, feeling the ghosts of their past echo in the air. David was already there, pacing the living room like a caged animal. When he turned to face her, his eyes were dark, hollowed out by the weight of his own mistakes. "Sarah Jane," he began, his voice low and strained. "We don't have to do this in court. We can work this out, just the two of us." She raised an eyebrow, her expression calm. "There's nothing to work out, David. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them," his jaw clenched, frustration flashing across his face. "You're being unreasonable," he snapped. "You're tearing everything apart just to punish me." She let out a soft laugh, cold and humorless. I'm not punishing you, David. I'm protecting myself. You're the one who broke this. I'm just making sure you can't rewrite the story. For a moment, he looked like he might argue further, but then he slumped back into the couch, running a hand through his hair. I made a mistake, he said finally, his voice cracking. I know I hurt you. I know I was wrong. But you don't have to destroy everything we built. Sarah Jane's gaze hardened. You destroyed it the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you. Don't pretend this is about saving our marriage. It's about saving yourself. He looked up at her, and for the first time in months, she saw something raw in his eyes, fear. You're right, he said quietly. I don't want to lose everything, the business. It's my life, Sarah Jane. You know that. Please, don't take it from me. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. This was the man she had once loved, the man she had stood beside through every challenge. But the man sitting in front of her now wasn't the partner she had married. He was a stranger who would have gladly watched her crumble if it meant protecting his empire. Half of that business is mine, she said finally, her voice steady. You agreed to that when you signed the prenup. You don't get to walk away from it just because it's inconvenient now. He swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping. Sarah Jane, I'm begging you, he whispered. Please, don't do this to me. She felt a flicker of something pity maybe, but she pushed it away. I didn't do this to you, David. You did it to yourself. The words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. David sat there staring at her, with a kind of desperate helplessness she had never seen before. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. But then she remembered every late night she'd spent alone, every lie he'd told to her face, and she knew she couldn't let herself waver. I'll give you a few days, she said quietly. Figure out how you want to handle this. But understand this, David. I'm not going away. You can beg, you can threaten, you can try to manipulate me, but it won't work. I know who I am now, and I know what I deserve. She turned and walked out of the house, each step a quiet act of defiance. The autumn wind was crisp against her skin as she stepped outside, and she felt a strange kind of peace settle over her. David's desperation wasn't her burden to carry anymore. She had her own future to build, one that didn't include him. In the days that followed, David's pleas became more frantic. He called her late at night, his voice raw and broken. He sent her long, rambling emails promising to change, swearing that he would make it up to her. But Sarah Jane didn't answer. She let his words pile up, each one, a reminder of how far she had come, and how far she would never go back. Ethan kept her updated on the progress of the case, his calm, measured voice a constant source of reassurance. He's trying to stall, Ethan told her one afternoon over the phone. But don't worry, we have everything we need. The prenup is airtight, and the evidence of his affair is overwhelming. He can't run from this. Sarah Jane nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Thank you, Ethan. I appreciate everything you're doing. Don't thank me, he said gently. You're the one who's done the hard work. You're the one who stood up for herself. I'm just here to make sure you get what you deserve. That night, as she lay in her bed, she thought about how far she'd come. Just weeks ago, she had felt lost and broken, a woman shattered by the man she thought she'd spend forever with. Now she was stronger than she'd ever been, steadier, wiser, and unshakable. She knew the battle wasn't over. David was still grasping at whatever scraps of control he could find, still trying to twist the story to make himself the victim. But Sarah Jane didn't care. She was done letting his narrative define her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood at the window of her childhood home, looking out at the garden she had always loved. The autumn leaves were a riot of color, gold and red and fiery orange dancing in the cool breeze. She let herself smile just a little as she realized that the most beautiful things in life often came after the storm. David's desperation was his own undoing. Sarah Jane had finally learned that her worth wasn't tied to anyone else's validation. She was her own woman, and nothing and no one could take that away from her. Sarah Jane sat at her desk one late evening, the soft glow of her lamp casting long shadows across the neatly stacked documents that symbolized her resolve. She'd spent countless hours here, poring over every line of the prenup, every piece of evidence she'd collected. Each word she read was a reminder of how far she had come and how deeply she had transformed. David's desperate pleas still echoed in her mind, his tearful phone calls, his frantic texts, promising change and second chances. A year ago, those words might have pulled her back in, might have made her doubt the strength she carried inside. But not now. Now she saw them for what they were, empty echoes of a man who had never really valued her. The lesson she had learned was hard-won and carved deep. Her worth didn't depend on anyone else's validation. She had spent so many years bending herself to fit the shape of David's expectations, trying to be the perfect wife, the supportive partner who could soothe his insecurities. But David's betrayal had forced her to look in the mirror and see the woman she really was, strong, capable, and deserving of more than half-hearted love. Ethan's words from their last meeting came back to her in quiet moments. "You're the one who did the hard work." She hadn't realized then how true that was. This fight wasn't just about getting her fair share of David's business. It was about reclaiming every part of herself she'd given away. Every time David had belittled her, every time he'd made her feel like she wasn't enough, she'd slowly chipped away at her own confidence. But not anymore. As the days turned into weeks, she watched David's facade begin to crack. His business, once his pride and joy, was now a house of cards teetering on the edge of collapse. Without her support, her sharp mind and steady hand, he was left scrambling to keep up. The mistress he'd once flaunted so proudly had disappeared the moment she realized David's pockets weren't as deep as she'd hoped. Karma Sarah Jane thought Riley had a way of showing up right on time. And yet even as she watched David's world crumble, she felt no satisfaction in his downfall. That was another lesson she'd learned. Revenge, in the end, wasn't about crushing your enemies. It was about rising above them. It was about showing yourself that you were always stronger than they ever imagined. One chilly morning, as the first snow of winter began to dust the city in white, Sarah Jane found herself standing in the quiet garden of her childhood home. The garden had always been a place of peace for her, a place where the world slowed down and she could hear her own thoughts. She wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders and let her breath fog in the crisp air. She thought about the girl she used to be, the girl who had believed in fairy tales and happy endings. That girl had been brave in her own way. But this woman standing here now, she was unstoppable. She had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and the weight of starting over, and she had emerged from it all with her head held high. The divorce was nearly finalized. Ethan had handled everything with the precision of a master strategist, ensuring that David had no choice but to honor the prenup. Half of the business was hers now, no matter how much David had tried to fight it. She'd also secured her share of the house, the investments, every asset she'd been entitled to. But more than that, she'd secured her freedom. David had tried to stall the proceedings, of course. He'd tried to paint her as greedy, vindictive, unstable. But the truth was always there, shining through the lies like a beacon. Sarah Jane had the evidence. She had the law. And most of all, she had the quiet, unwavering belief in herself that no one could ever take away. The final papers arrived in a thick envelope delivered to her door on a snowy afternoon. She held them in her hands, feeling the weight of them, the final punctuation mark on a chapter of her life that had nearly broken her. She didn't feel the need to read every word. She knew what they said. She signed her name with a steady hand, her heart calm and clear. When David came to return the last of her belongings, a box of old photos, a few of her favorite books, he looked like a man hollowed out by his own choices. His eyes were dull, his shoulders slumped. "Sarah Jane," he said, his voice rough. "I'm sorry." She nodded, but said nothing. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need his validation. She had already found her own. As he left, she closed the door softly behind him. She took a moment to lean against it, letting out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. This was it. The end of one life, the beginning of another. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled into the old armchair by the window, watching the snow fall outside. The city was quiet tonight, the streetlights casting a warm glow against the white drifts. She thought about the future, the one she was building on her own terms. It wasn't about David anymore. It wasn't even about the business she'd fought so hard to reclaim. It was about the woman she'd become and the life she would create for herself. She thought about the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, about the mornings she'd woken up with a pit of dread in her stomach. And she thought about how those days were behind her now, how she had walked through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. A smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she took a sip of her wine. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew she was ready for it. She was done letting anyone else define her worth. The snow kept falling soft and silent, and Sarah Jane let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the universe's way of telling her she was exactly where she needed to be. She had learned her lesson the hard way, that real power doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from knowing yourself and never letting anyone dim your light. She had learned to stand tall, to speak her truth, and to never settle for less than she deserved. As she sat there, the final divorce papers signed, and the world outside wrapped in winter's quiet hush, Sarah Jane felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The first days of her newfound freedom felt almost surreal to Sarah Jane. The weight of the divorce papers was gone, replaced by the lightness of possibility. She no longer woke up to David's shadow looming over her, no longer had to tiptoe around his moods or second-guess her worth. The silence of her new mornings was no longer hollow. It was peaceful. It was hers. She stood by her bedroom window one crisp winter morning, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands. The snow had stopped falling overnight, and the world outside sparkled beneath a soft sun that felt like a promise. Sarah Jane watched as a cardinal landed on the fence, its bright red feathers a vivid splash of color against the white landscape. It reminded her of herself, a vibrant force that wouldn't be diminished by the cold. She was no longer the woman who had once tied her identity to someone else's love. She had taken back her voice, her dignity, and her dreams. The fight had been long and painful, but it had also been worth it. In the quiet, she could almost hear the echoes of the girl she used to be, the girl who had believed in fairy tales. And she smiled because she knew now that the truest magic wasn't in the promises others made, but in the strength she found within herself. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "The final documents have been filed. You're officially free." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, a small laugh of relief and triumph. The world seemed to crack open before her, full of endless possibilities. Sarah Jane set her mug down and picked up the small notebook she kept on her desk pages, filled with dreams and plans she'd put on hold for too long. She ran her finger down the list: travels she wanted to take, projects she wanted to build, maybe even a new love that was truly worthy of her. But those were for tomorrow. Today was for her, for taking a deep breath, for smiling at her reflection, and for knowing she had faced her worst fears and emerged victorious.